Good evening, everyone, and welcome to BT's Fly Tying Friday. Tonight, the 21st of April, 2023, we have the pleasure of learning from Dick Rohrbaugh about tying PMDs and probably a few tricks on fishing them as well. The weekly tip tonight, we're going to discuss monofilament. But greetings to all of you. We're the BTs from Boise, Idaho. Dick Rohrbaugh retired from a 35-year college teaching career that was at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, and is now able to spend more time pursuing fly fishing and tying. Both have been a passion of his since he was a kid fishing the wonderful streams of western Montana. The world-famous Dan Bailey was a mentor and a family friend. Dick has taken those long ago learned skills and passed them along to others via teaching, demonstrating at various clubs and shows, and even done a bit of guiding as a charity contribution for Trout Unlimited. He tells us, "We winter in Oregon, but live half of each year in our log home on the Madison River, not far from the West Fork, where fly fishing is as good as it gets." Tonight, Dick will be providing information about pale morning duns. And Dick, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. A few comments before we jump into it. I think most fly anglers would agree that the PMD is one of the iconic hatches in western rivers. They're prevalent on the Madison, on many others rivers in western Montana. They're prolific not only on the river, but there's a phenomenon. I'll talk a little more about fishing later, but there's a phenomenon that occurs on the Madison River in Montana that not a lot of fishermen know about. PMD hatch is basically a river hatch. They tend to hatch in slow-moving water. And one of the things that means is that as the Madison comes down into, let's say, Quake Lake, or comes down into Ennis Lake, just before the stream enters the lake, there's still a bit of current. The fish in both lakes have caught on to the idea that that's the dinner table. That's where all the PMDs will be coming down the river, and they end up right there at the head of the lake where the river comes in. And as a result of that, the fish just line up at the dinner table, and the catch rates can be truly enormous. One day, 2 summers ago, my son and I and 2 other guys, standing just a few, maybe 100 feet up into the Madison before it goes into Ennis Lake, we each caught 20 fish without any difficulty. My son caught 20 and never moved his feet. And it's because that particular area of the head of a lake tends to concentrate the PMDs that are coming down the river. And it's one of the things that got me hooked on PMD fishing and fly tying. So that's what I want to talk a little about tonight. Now, I'm going to tie 2 patterns tonight. One, I chose the PMD split case nymph. It's not the easiest fly in the world to tie, and you don't see it too often, but it has some techniques that are interesting. And so I thought it might be worth giving it a look here tonight. Now, I'm well aware that there are hundreds and hundreds of PMD patterns, and many of them are very fine patterns. They catch a lot of fish, but the split case nymph, I have found to be especially productive, and its interesting technique means it's the reason I chose that one tonight. The second fly that we're going to look at is one I created myself. And I can't talk about its fishing record because I just created it this winter. I know it'll catch fish, but I wanted to tie it tonight because I want to show you why I developed a new fly, what the thinking process was as I developed it, and what features I thought it needed to have to imitate a very specific phenomenon that occurs with PMD hatches. So I'll explain that more when we get to it. But for right now, we're going to start out with the split case nymph. Now here in the upper side part of this slide, you can see a picture of a PMD. Actually, there are two PMD species in Western rivers. They're both in the ephemerella group, the inermis and the infrequens, but they're very, very difficult to tell apart. And so trying to tell them apart is of no importance to anglers. It does sometimes surprise new anglers, however, to discover that PMDs come in a variety of colors. While they're predominantly yellow, some have a yellow body and a yellow wing. Some have a yellow body and a grayish wing. Some are somewhat olive in color. They also come in different sizes. The PMDs on the Madison River are a good healthy size 14. But PMDs are very, very common on spring creeks. They inhabit slow-moving waters that way. In the spring creeks of Montana, for example, in Armstrong Spring Creek, PMDs are usually about a size 16, but in Nelson Spring Creek, they can be as small as 20. So I usually tie them in a lot of different sizes. I don't vary color much, even though they can be different colors, because I haven't found that it really makes a lot of difference. They're predominant in spring creeks and tailwaters for a reason. Both tailwaters and spring creeks have constant temperature, cool water. And that's something that tends to produce PMD hatches. So I fish them mostly there. There, by the way, you see one with a much grayer wing and an olive-colored body. The time of day they hatch varies from water to water, but predominantly it's late morning. On the Madison, that's very much affected by the weather. I've seen them come off as late as 3 in the afternoon on a very cold day, and particularly a cold, rainy day. The hatch on the Madison will last usually about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. But on cloudy days, I've seen it last 3 hours. One of the characteristics of PMDs that we're going to fiddle with a little today is the fact that PMDs have a great deal of difficulty in hatching. They tend to drift for long distances on the surface, drying their wings. And the difficulty causes a large number of cripples. They cripple actually more than any mayfly I fish. Sometimes Baetis hatches can produce a lot of cripples, the blue wing olives. But PMD hatches are notorious for cripples. And a little later in the program, we're going to get to working on a cripple pattern that I developed this winter. And I want to show you how I did it and why I did it the way I did. But the nymphs are taken very readily. These are crawler nymphs. They're very clumsy swimmers. And as they begin to get active and at the beginning of a hatch, they tend to drift in rather uncontrolled fashion in the slow currents of quieter waters. The fish are familiar with that. And so as the hatch begins, that particular location on a stream is where you want to be fishing the nymph. So we're going to talk about the nymph and this cripple. Now, if we want to do the whole life cycle, we would also do the dung. And I thought about doing that this evening, but a week ago, Al presented a very, very fine program on sparkle duns. That's the primary pattern I use to fish the duns. And Al was quite correct in pointing out how picky on duns the fish in the Spring Creek can be. And he showed us a delightful pattern last week for imitating that characteristic the picky fish are after. And there's no point in my repeating that tonight. So I'm going to skip the dun, and we're going to concentrate on the nymph and the cripple. Now here's a picture of a PMD nymph. Notice the brownish, yellowish coloring. That can vary. In some streams, they can be rather light brown, almost yellowish. In other streams, they're very dark brown. That's true on the Madison. This would be fairly typical of a Madison nymph. And I want you to notice two characteristics of this nymph, because we're going to try to imitate both of them in the fly we tie. Notice how chunky it is. These are not long, skinny nymphs. They're typical of crawler nymphs. They tend to be chunky, broad, and that's one feature to think about. The second feature I'd like you to notice is look at the abdomen, and you can see on both sides of the abdomen the gill fibers. An awful lot of the nymph patterns that you'll find in fly shops for PMDs don't imitate the gills. I think it's important to do that. And so I'm gonna tie a split case pattern tonight, I'm gonna add gill fibers to it, which many of the Tyers who use it don't. So here's the materials we're going to use. I'm going to tie it on the Daiichi 1730. And I'll show you when we look at that hook, I'll show you why I've chosen that one. I'm going to tie it in a 14 just because it's a little bigger and easier to see, though I more often tie it in 16. I'm just using 8/0 thread. You can use either yellow or brown. We'll use pheasant tail fibers for the tail. I'll talk a little more about them later. We'll have a brown dubbing for a body or an abdomen. And then we're going to put gills on it. You can use either brown or yellow ostrich herl. I'm going to use brown tonight. It'll have a ribbing of copper wire. And then we're going to have a split wing case. Probably the majority of Tyers use black goose. I use brown. You can use turkey biots rather than the goose. Turkey are much larger. I'm actually going to use goose tonight. You could use either one. Then we're going to have a yellow hot spot on the back of the thorax. That's the characteristic of the split case nymph. And I want to, if you're not familiar with it, I want to introduce yellow razor foam to you. We'll make a thorax of brown ice dubbing and the legs of tail fibers. So here's the first fly that we're going to tie. Now, this is a classic. It won't focus quite as well when I turn it up like this. This is a classic split case PMD nymph. You notice the yellow hot spot on the front up at the top of the thorax. That's the important characteristic of this particular pattern. What is not usually tied on this pattern are the gill fibers on the back, and I'm going to show you how to do that tonight. And so that's the pattern we're going to tie. If I turn it down here, it's a little more, in a little better focus. So let me take this out of the vise and put a hook in it, and we'll get started. So, like I said, this is a Daiichi 1730. And I like this particular nymph hook for a reason. Notice that the shank has a bend in it. And that gives you a good way to create the proportions in this fly. The thorax will be the front section, the abdomen, the back section, and the divide between the two will be right where that bend is. And I like that little feature. So this makes a good hook on which to tie that this type of nymph. So I'm going to be using Danville 8/0 tonight for the thread, and I'm using brown. And we'll tie on here right at that bend in the hook shank. And we're going to make a tail out of pheasant. This is, now you can just see it. This is pretty familiar to most people. We'll just take a few fibers of the pheasant tail, and that will make our tail. Now, when you pull barbules off a feather, pull them out straight like that. That will help even up the tips out here. So we'll take those off and try to get about the right length on here. I need to get my thread back to the bend of the hook, or the back of the hook. Tie our tail on with a couple of wraps. That might be just a hair long. Now I'm going to wrap this all the way up to that hump in the hook. And part of the reason for doing that is I want to begin building a little bulk into the back of this thorax. Remember, we're talking about a chunky nymph. Next thing we're going to tie in is copper wire. So this part of this fly will be quite familiar. Many patterns do this. And I'll come back right to where I tied in the tail. Now, the next thing I'm going to put on here is another chunk of pheasant, a bunch of pheasant fibers. They're going to be pulled over the back of the abdomen, and you may wonder why I didn't just use the fibers from the bunch that I tied with the tail. And again, my reason for adding another bunch here is that I want a little more bulk. I also want more. If I tied that many on for the tail, it would be an overly heavy tail and wouldn't work very well. Note again, I pull them straight out to get the fibers even. So we'll pull them off, and I'm going to clip off the tips. I don't need those, but then I'm going to tie them in by the tip right back here where we have the copper wire in the tail. And we'll get all that on there and leave it for the moment. There's a lot of stuff goes on this pattern. A lot of people don't like to tie it because of that, but I'm adding one thing that you don't see on the normal split case nymph, and that's the gills. And to do it, I'm going to tie on a piece of brown ostrich herl. And it's important that I get it right back here where I have the tail and the other materials tied in. We'll leave that for a second. And then I'm going to dub an abdomen with just some brown dubbing, something that's a little bit golden brown. And we're going to begin to build up the thorax area of this critter. So you don't want to be afraid to make this a little hefty. Remember, we're talking about a pretty chunky nymph here. I think I'll even add a little more to that. So now I've got the abdomen dubbed in. I'm going to wrap the gill fibers. And I'm doing that with this herl. I'm just going to wrap them up the up the abdomen. And you can pack them in there a bit if you like. And tie that off at the front. So that will represent the gills on the nymph. Now I want to bring this over the top of the abdomen. And I'm going to tie it down with this. Whoops, I got to get all of them. With the copper wire. And I'm going to do one wrap of the copper wire right here at the back. And then I'm going to start angling my way up the body, up the abdomen. And one of the things you have to watch when you do this is the wire tends to push it off the top of the hook. So you got to, as you wrap it up, you want to keep that pheasant tail right on top of the bug. This way we create a little bit of segmentation. In the body of the bug, and we'll get it all the way up here to the center. Tie that off. Now we can clip this pheasant off and we get rid of the wire. And you can see that we've now got pretty hefty set of gills on our critter, and that's what we're after. Now I'm going to build this up here a little bit in the front, and you'll see why in just a moment. What I'm trying to do here is get a flat place where I can tie in the split case. Now, for the split case, the majority of people use goose biots. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. I use them in dark brown. You can see them there. You can also use turkey. These are turkey biots, and you can see they're much, much bigger. It's a little overkill, I think, for this fly. You can use them, but I'm going to be using the goose. So here is a goose biot fiber. And what I want to do is just clip off a little bit of the tip, just a little bit of that. And I'm going to tie it in with the concave side up, and I want it right back here where the thorax is going to begin. And you need to take a little time and get these on here right. Now, what I'm trying to do is I want it like that, splayed out to the side, but I don't want it up in the center of the top. I want it about the 3/4 mark on the side of the abdomen. That's one. Then we'll do the same thing, a little clip off the front of the other one. And we'll tie the other one in the same way at the same location. And again, at about 3/4 of the way up. So that's what you're trying to achieve. Now I can see right now that I don't have them both tied all the way back to exactly the same tie-in point. So we're getting there. I want exactly the same tie-in point for both sides. There, we got it. Now, the next thing we need to put on here, as I said, this thing's got a lot of parts to it, is the yellow hotspot. And what I'm going to use, that writing is backwards on there, but that's called razor foam. It's made by Avid Max. I think there are other manufacturers as well. And my reason for using this is it's very, very thin. It's 1 millimeter. I don't know if you can see that, but it's very, very thin foam. I don't know how clear that is. You could use regular, 2 or 3 mil foam, but it's too bulky and creates too big a hot spot. So what I've done is I've cut a little narrow strip of it, and I'm going to tie that in, and I need to get this also right exactly back where those goose biots are tied in. And it's important that you try to get this right on top of the hook, like that, so it's not off to one side. So next, you remember we've got a pretty doggone bulky thorax on these things. I'm going to use this, again, that's backwards, but it's flash dubbing. It's similar to ice dubbing. I like the flashiness of it. And we're going to dub in here a pretty hefty thorax for this bug. You don't want to try to put too much on the thread at once, but get it right back there. We'll work our way forward. And see if we can get a nice hefty thorax on there. I got a lot of slop here that I'm going to trim off a little bit. Some of the fibers are a little longer than I want. Now the next thing we need, we do have one more ingredient. We need some legs on this thing. And again, we're going to use pheasant tail fibers. They work very well. And there's a number of different ways you can put these on a hook. I'll show you the way I like to do it. So I just grabbed a bunch of them, and I'm going to turn my vise up to the side, lay the fibers in, and I'm going to put a couple of loose wraps around them. You can see they're way too long, but that allows me to pull them up so I get them exactly the length I want. Then I can do some tight wraps and cut those off. So that's what I've got on one side. Then I'm going to repeat the same process on the other side. Another little bunch of pheasant fibers. This time I'll turn my vise up this way so I can see what I'm doing. Couple loose turns, and then I can pull it so I get it so it's exactly the length the ones on the other side. Then I can wrap it down tight and trim it off. So the next thing obviously we have to do is bring the wing case over, and you don't want to get too close to the eye when you do this. So this wing case is our hot spot. And it's designed to sort of look like the wing case is breaking open and the yellow of the actual bug is beginning to show. You want to tie that down pretty good so it doesn't pull out. Clip it off close. Then the last thing we have to do, so this is what we've got so far, is we have to bring this split wing case forward. And this can be a little delicate, so my hands are probably going to be in the way. But I'll pull that over. Now I've got it on one side. I'll come over here and bring the other side in. And now I've got it the other side, and they're crossed in the front. You'll see that a little better here in just a second. I'll clip them off. And now you can see that they're tied in across each other, and it gives me a nice little hot spot. We'll build up a little bit of a head, and we'll finish that bad boy off. And we will have a split case PMD nymph. Won't be as quite as good a focus, but let me turn it on the side so you can see it. Get the wings back here where they, or the legs where they belong. Those legs are a little too long, but at least you get the idea. I want to show you this fly I created, and I wanted to show you why I created it, first of all. I want you to look closely at this phenomenon. I've told you that PMDs cripple a lot, and they do. In any good heavy PMD hatch, you will see these things all over the surface. The fish don't go on them exclusively, because even the duns ride the surface a long way trying to dry their wings, but they do. Fish are familiar with this phenomenon, trust me. And they will often feed on them quite heavily. So here are two examples of PMDs that tried to hatch and didn't make it. It's a phenomenon that is so common, we need to imitate it. And I haven't found many patterns that do that. So I decided to cook up my own. Take a look at this picture. This is not actually a PMD hatching, but this is the only picture I could find of the phenomenon that I'm interested in imitating. You can see the shuck that is trailing behind that critter. The actual hatching insect is partway out of the shuck, but it has not separated from the shuck. Now, I couldn't find a picture of a PMD doing this, but that phenomenon you will see in a PMD hatch. And what I wanted to try to do was see if I could cook up a pattern that would imitate that phenomenon. I think I've come up with one, and I'm going to show it to you tonight, and I'm going to call it a PMD spotlight. And I'll tell you why I called it a PMD spotlight in a little bit, but here are the materials. I'm going to be using a Daiichi 1130. Again, I'll tie it in 14, and I'm using just 8/0 yellow thread, copper wire. We're going to need some pearl flashabou. Then we're going to make a shuck out of micro chenille, and it's brown, and I'm going to burn the tip of it. That's one of the things I wanted to show you tonight and why we do that. We'll have an emerging wing. You can use yellow or light dun CDC. I don't have any yellow at the moment, so I'm going to use a light dun. Yellow dubbing, and then a light dun or a yellow hackle. So those are the things that we're going to use. And now let me show you the fly that I came up with. What I'm trying to imitate here is you can see the brown chenille at the back imitates that shuck that it has not yet escaped from. Then we need an emergent wing that's beginning to emerge. And there you can see the yellow or the gray light dun CDC that will help give this a little flotation, because I want it right in the surface film. And then finally, we've got the body in yellow emerging out of the shuck, the thorax, and the hackle on the fly. So what I'm trying to do is find a way to imitate the segments of this phenomenon that occurs on the surface, and I cannot wait to go fish this on the Madison River. But anyway, that's what we're going to try to tie tonight. Oh, let me tell you why I called it a PMD spotlight. There is an older pattern called a spotlight. It's a caddis imitation. And it uses this kind of a shuck phenomenon for an emerging caddis. And I thought, why can't I adapt that to a PMD? So that's what I'm trying to do with this particular pattern. And I borrowed the name, but I'll call it a PMD spotlight, just to make clear what I'm doing. So the hook that I'm going to use is a PM or a Daiichi 1130. And this is a 14. So it's a typical, you could use any curved hook. And begin by putting on our thread. Whoops. And trying to remember all the steps I've got in this thing. So I'm going to put on some copper wire again. It's amazing when you think about it, how many patterns use copper wire. Come back here, and I want to come down around the bend a little bit because I want this thorax to hang down. The next thing I'm going to tie in is a strip. Can't remember if I had this in the description, but a strip of flashaboo. And my reason for putting this on here is I want a little sparkle in this critter. And so I'm going to tie it right here at the back. And I'm going to wrap it up the body. What's actually the shuck of this thing. When I'm done, only the bottom half of this will show, but that's all right. That's where I want the sparkle to appear. So I'm going to come up, just spiral this up the body so I get a little flash on the bottom. And I'll come up here to the front and tie that off. I'll remove it. And then we're going to tie in the micro chenille. Maybe you are familiar with this. Again, the lettering's backwards there, but this is the micro size. Yeah, micro chenille, and in a dark brown. You may wonder, why am I using chenille of all things for a shuck? Well, the reason I am is because you can tell this stuff's going to absorb water. And what that means is it's going to sink this direction. And it's going to look like the shuck that's hanging down into the water, even though the other half of the fly is going to be floating. That's the reason for the chenille. We have to get this chenille doctored a little bit because we want it in the shape of a shuck. So maybe some of you are familiar with this phenomenon. I'm going to take a lighter and I'm going to burn the end of this and watch what happens. Do you see how that created a point? Just takes a very little, you don't want to get that flame on too much, but just a little point will be created by using a lighter on the back of it. And that's what I want the back of this shuck to look like. So I want it to hang off the back of the hook a ways, but I'm going to tie it in up here at the front. I'll cut off the excess. And then I'm going to secure it to the hook with the copper wire. And that's going to help create a segmented look as I come up what's really the dangling shuck. So now what I've got is I've got a shuck on there hanging off the back. It'll absorb water and hence stay underwater. And I've got a segmented looking shuck that has a shiny bottom to it. And that shiny bottom I want because as the shuck is right up near the surface like that, it always looks shiny with the sunlight on it. And that's a characteristic of this that I wanted to imitate. Now, the next thing I want to do is put this emerging wing on, and I'm going to do it. You could do it with any kind of CDC, but I discovered that, I don't know if you're familiar with these CDC puffs. These little puffs, they work as well as anything. So I've got two of them here, kind of scrunched together. And I'm going to tie that in right back here so it'll look like a wing that is beginning to emerge from that sorry looking shuck. I'll clip that off. Tidy up here a little bit in the front. So now I've got a shuck and the beginnings of a wing. The next thing I need to put on is a hackle. And I'm just gonna, this is a whiting, it's a high quality hackle. And it's in a light dun. As I noted earlier, sometimes these things are absolutely a solid yellow color from one end to the other. Sometimes the wings on them are gray, and that's often true on the Madison. It's less often true on the Spring Creeks. But I'll just tie my hackle in back here so it's ready. And the last thing I need is the yellow body of the emerging insect. And I'll do that just with yellow dubbing. And I'm using superfine dubbing because I want the front half of this fly to float. We'll get a little of this on here. Just a little more. And what this is designed to imitate is that body of the emerging insect that's trying to work its way out of the shuck. Then we're gonna palmer the hackle up that. Tie it off. We'll cut it off and whip finish it, and then we just have one more thing to do. Put a little head on here. Let's see. I trapped a fiber or two up here. We can get rid of that. Now remember, this thing is an emerger. We don't want it floating high in the water the way a dry fly would. We have the chenille back here that's going to absorb some water and tilt this thing down, but we don't want the front up too high either. So what we're going to do is come in here and trim the hackle off the bottom. Because I want it to sit down on the water. And there we have a finished PMD spotlight. Oh, like I said, I can't, in all honesty, give you the fishing record. But I hope you understand the logic of what I was trying to create as I worked through various steps of cooking this thing up. And I can guarantee you it will get a good workout on both the Madison and the Spring Creeks this summer. So questions?
You do
Well,
realize, Dick, that we expect a report from you.
okay.
Yeah. And by the way, Gerald says, great presentation, very realistic. Thank you.
Good.
And tonight's tip is an interesting one for us. It's monofilament information. And I asked Dutch to share some stuff with you. And in fact, you'll find that information and a ton of other stuff that he has on his website called flyfishingskills.com. One of the things that interesting things that we've discovered as we've traveled through this Zoom world is how we're looked at sometimes by people as experts. And in the real world, we're experts in a very narrow field because that's what we focused on in our professional lives as fly tyers. And there's a whole lot of things where we just don't know anything about it. As an example, last night, Sherry Steele asked me to comment about thread. Well, I can comment about thread. It's called Danville. End of story. Because that's all I've used for 40 years. And I'm not saying that there aren't other good threads out there, but there's some great threads out there. Well, something came up the other night on our Zoom session. We talked about monofilament and fluorocarbon as if they were different products. And quite frankly, I've never fished with fluorocarbon. I use Maxima, have for 40 years, don't plan on changing, love this stuff. But that said, doesn't mean that I know all about fluorocarbon. And it was real obvious when Dutch Baughman sent me some information from his website that starts like this. And Dutch, I'm going to have you take it over at this point and talk to us about it.
Thank you, Al. Gretchen, I appreciate that. Monofilament is a word that simply refers to a single strand. And in our fly fishing world and fly tying world, that single strand is monofilament, and that monofilament can be nylon, it can be fluorocarbon, it can be PVC, it can be many other types of products, but it simply means single strand. And what's happened over time, I think, is that we've gotten to a point, we've gotten kind of lazy in that we refer to nylon monofilament now simply as monofilament. And you'll hear it often referred to, even in publications, as monofilament or fluorocarbon. And the fact of the matter is they both are monofilament, but because they're two different products, they are very different in many ways. The nylon monofilament, as you said, Al, was all we had up until the 1980s. The early 1980s, 1971. In 1971, Seagar, the Japanese line company, created something called fluorocarbon. And it was a monofilament product, but the fluorocarbon itself was a higher, or thicker, closer, tighter density than nylon. And when compared to nylon, there are many features that you can compare, but they are definitely different. So it means single strand, but it can be nylon, it can be PVC, it can be fluorocarbon, a lot of different things. And prior to 1971, Al, just as you said, we used almost exclusively nylon monofilament, and it wasn't until the 1980s where we saw the introduction of tapered knotless leaders. And when that occurred, those of us that had been accustomed, as you said, to building our leaders by tying sections of monofilament together, typically nylon monofilament, that was replaced by the tapered knotless leader. And many fly fishers still today like to tie their own leaders. But in any case, there are quite a few things to compare between the nylon and the fluorocarbon. For example, one thing that right off the top is fluorocarbon is going to be 3 or 4 times as expensive as nylon monofilament. But because nylon, or because fluorocarbon monofilament is a tighter, denser material, allegedly it will sink faster. And what's interesting to me is that although fluorocarbon's been around since 1971, we still see studies done trying to validate the translucent feature, the sink quality, things like that about the fluorocarbon, trying to validate it. The fluorocarbon is more abrasion resistant. It does eliminate fiber optics, meaning that when fluorocarbon enters the water and begins to sink through the water column, it eliminates the fiber optic, meaning the UV ray is not retained, and it looks more transparent. And of course, if you're going to fish the flies like Dick just showed us, you want a leader or tippet material that will be not detected by the fish if possible. But there is a claim that fluorocarbon sinks faster. There are studies recently that show that the difference in sink rate is negligible, although fluorocarbon will sink a little bit faster than nylon monofilament. The other thing that has evolved over the years is that fluorocarbon has been reported as being difficult to tie some knots. Some knot profiles are more difficult. And one other additional study I saw on that one some years ago was that with fluorocarbon, you have to make certain that you're actually tying the knot on the level portion of the leader. If we look at a 9-foot tapered leader, for example, the 2 feet or 24 to 30 inch distance between the tip, from the tip going toward the butt section, that first 24 to 30 inches is level, meaning there's no more taper. The taper occurs from the butt section down to about 6.5 or 7 feet. Then the remaining 2 feet of the leader is actually level. What makes a difference if you tie your knot on the level portion of the tippet instead of on the tapered portion of the leader? So there's some comparisons here and there, but I know many people that, just like you said, Al, are aware of fluorocarbon, and for one reason or another, mainly because of the cost, they choose not to use fluorocarbon. Some people, some of the competition, nymph fishermen like to use fluorocarbon, getting those bottom flies deeper in the water column. But in any case, monofilament simply means single strand, and there's a nylon monofilament, and there's a fluorocarbon monofilament.
And we thank you very much for that. Before I leave this last slide, though, I want to again point out that I added to Dutch's slide the words flyfishingskills.com. Write that down, flyfishingskills.com. Anyway, Dutch, thank you. You didn't even know that I was going to call on you, and I didn't know if you were going to show up. And I was prepared to do all that myself, but you did it so much better than me, so that was fine too. Because I would have been the blind leading the blind, because the reason we were doing it is because I didn't know in the first darn place. So,
thank you, Al.
One of the things I want to get into in a moment, might as well do it just right now, is in sharing on BT's fly tying Fridays.
Don't forget the Fly Fishing International, the fly tying group, is having their first annual rendezvous in Branson, Missouri, and that's on September 14th, 15th, and 16th. For those of you that are with the fly tying group, members of the fly tying group, you should have received your invitation this week, I think Tuesday. And we're going to be taking in those invitations, and we're trying to limit the number of tires to 100 because that's the amount of space we have in Branson, Missouri. And so the next set of invitations going out will be on the 17th of May, and that will be to everybody that has a membership in FFI. So if you're a member of FFI, in order to participate in this rendezvous, you'll have to spend a couple bucks joining the fly tying group, because this rendezvous is for the fly tying group. We're going to have Friday and Saturday are all tying days. We're going to have a banquet on Friday night. We also have some half-price tickets to one of the shows in Branson, the Texas Tenors, if you'd like to go. It's a great place to bring your family and to have a good time, and also a great place to fish. They call it Lake Taneycomo. I call it the White River, but a lot of big browns and a lot of big rainbows there. So if anybody has any questions, please email me at flytyerfred, it's FLYTYERFRED@gmail.com. That's it.
Fred, thank you. Hey, thank you everyone for joining us for tonight. And that's a wrap until next time.